B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, November 16th, 2020. We're into the final home stretch here, the Peter B. Collins Daily Podcast. A week from Wednesday, that is the 25th of November, will be my last daily podcast as I stumble off into retirement. So I want to report to you that I'm quite relieved that the concerns that I expressed on Friday's podcast have not come to pass so far. With the Oath Keepers and other armed supporters of Trump converging on Washington and staging rallies in other cities around the country, I was concerned that he was going to give a coded signal that would launch some sort of a right-wing revolution in this country, a last-ditch effort for Trump to cling to power. And as I say, so far that hasn't happened. There were some people arrested in Washington, out here in California, in Sacramento. There were some fist fights that broke out among right-wingers and counter-protesters. And even though Trump took his motorcade on the way to the golf course, that guy, through the crowd in Washington, D.C., he did not speak to the rally, the so-called Million MAGA March, that was staged in his honor. And so we're reaching a point where it's just plain ridiculous for Trump to hold out hope that somehow a miracle is going to occur that's going to change the outcome of this election and give him a second term. After all, the margins of the Electoral College projected so far are identical to the count in 2016, which Trump retold, and just told again over the entire past 4 years. Every mob rally, he had to recount how the Electoral College vote just kept going up and up and up until he had a landslide. Well, it wasn't really a landslide, but it was, based on the Electoral College count, a convincing lead for Trump. And now that Biden enjoys that same lead, it's not a landslide. And he continues to furiously tweet, but in his tweets and in some comments he made about the progress toward a vaccine on Friday, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but he blurts out comments like the next administration. He was saying that there would be no lockdown as long as Trump is president, and then he kind of goes into his who knows and this scrambled syntax. Then on Sunday morning, he took to Twitter, which I guess is his equivalent of pooping. I'm sorry. But, first thing in the morning, he's got a tweet. And he was referring to Biden, and he said he won because the election was rigged. So, there are these kind of slips of the tongue, or of the thumb in the case of tweeting, where Trump appears to be edging toward acceptance of the reality. Maybe it's because his former chief of staff, the retired General John Kelly, called his refusal to cooperate in the transition crazy. John Bolton was on the Sunday morning shows saying that the refusal harms the country. Bolton is not my favorite neocon, but he said every day that he delays under the pretense that he's simply asking for his legal remedies ultimately is to the country's disadvantage. As I've said before, there is a talking point in Washington, mostly coming from Democrats, that the 9/11 Commission, in its cover-up and whitewash, suspected that the delayed transition, while the Republicans stole the election in 2000, left George W. Bush improperly briefed for the threat of al-Qaeda. And that's just bullshit. He ignored the briefing that he got on August 6th of 2001 that said bin Laden determined to attack America. And so to claim that a briefing in December would prevent something the following September, I just find that silly. But in Washington, police arrested 21 people. One protester was stabbed. 4 officers were injured. These were sporadic clashes between Trump supporters and counter-protesters in the vicinity of the White House. And, of course, Trump, never one to try to de-escalate. He tweeted on Saturday evening, I guess he had a bad golf round, Antifa scum ran for the hills. D.C. police, get going, do your job, and don't hold back. And then just the way he did with Sean Spicy Spicer on, 2 days into his term as president, Trump sent Kayleigh McEnany out to claim that it was a huge crowd because crowd size is so important to Trump. And I will say, watching it on TV, there were more MAGA cult members than I expected. I haven't heard anyone claim that it was 1 million people except allies of the president. And I got some whiplash because Fox News was the best place that I could get coverage. And you would see the news anchors referring to Biden as the president-elect and actions that he's taking. Then they flip you back to Judge Jeanine Pirro. And I thought she had been fired from Fox last Monday. But there she was on Saturday night promoting these evidence-free claims of massive rigging of the vote count. And she trotted out this woman, Sidney, what's Sidney's last name? Sidney Powell, who has been the lawyer for the failed National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn. And she claimed that, there's a fire hose of evidence. Fire hose? That she is sifting through. Here it comes. President Trump won not just hundreds of thousands of votes, but by millions of votes that were shifted by this software that was designed expressly for that purpose. We have so much evidence, I feel like it's coming in through a fire hose. And at another point, Powell claimed that the CIA had ignored complaints about the software, which makes me wonder how much the CIA has used it for its own benefit in different places. And what's fascinating to me is that allies of Trump are picking up on the long-running concerns of election integrity advocates. I'm talking about the voting machines, talking about their hackability. And it's fascinating that suddenly they are concerned about the election process. They even invoked Elizabeth Warren, the senator who ran for president, who had raised questions about Dominion. And so this puts me in an awkward spot because I have often questioned the security and reliability of these, as Brad Friedman likes to put it, 100% unverifiable computer-based voting systems. But the late conversions coming from allies of Trump are not too persuasive. And so here's Kayleigh McEnany. In a tweet from her personal account, she claimed that more than 1 million, all caps, marchers for President Trump descend on the swamp in support. And the New York Times doesn't offer an estimate, just that authorities estimated it was far short of her claims. Then we look at the legal front, because the Republican lawyers who were representing Trump or various arms of the Republican Party in state-level election challenge cases, well, both Jones Day and the other firm quit on Friday. So you got Rudy Giuliani running the legal operation, and a conservative lawyer and former RNC official named James Bopp Jr. appears to have taken over some of them. So in a coordinated move, the legal filings in Michigan, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were all dropped at the instruction of James Bopp Jr. on Monday morning. There are still a couple of cases that are kind of bouncing around in the court systems. But late on Sunday night, a lawyer for the Trump campaign filed a new version of the Pennsylvania suit, cutting out one of Trump's loudest and most persistent accusations that Republican poll observers in the state were not given adequate access to monitor voting and vote counting. And they imagine that if a Republican is not there, that is the cue for an election worker to destroy Trump ballots or, fill out more Biden ballots and illegally submit them and count them. And there's just no evidence that any of this is occurring. And even if there weren't Republican suits, 6 feet away from an election worker, most of this stuff is being videotaped. And so these are just specious, desperate arguments. They are clutching at straws. And here's another one of these half-assed statements from a Trump official. Robert O'Brien, the National Security Advisor, said in comments that were broadcast today that there would be a very professional transition. However, it is qualified. Quote, "Look, if the Biden-Harris ticket is determined to be the winner, and obviously things look that way now, we'll have a very professional transition from the National Security Council. If there is a new administration, they deserve some time to come in and implement their policies," O'Brien said. "And if we're in a situation where we are not going into a Trump second term, which I think people from where I'm sitting in the White House would like to see, if it's another outcome, it'll be a professional transition." So he is, on the one hand, saying, sure, we'll do a transition. But then, like Mike Pompeo, he talks about a second Trump administration as if there is any possibility of that occurring. So he speaks with forked tongue. And that's what you've got to do when you're dancing around with a narcissist like Donald Trump, and a vindictive son of a bitch narcissist at that. And then we get to the Hail Mary in the Peach State, where the beleaguered Brad Raffensperger, who is a Republican, who has been the target of Republicans in the past week or two, because, well, he was unable to rig the election sufficiently to declare Trump the winner. And so Raffensperger, without a legal basis, just said, hey, we're going to have a recount and an audit and an RLS, whatever that means, I can't remember. And so all of that is underway right now. Roughly 2/3 of the 5 million ballots cast in Georgia's presidential race have been recounted by hand, with local elections officials reporting few problems and Democrats saying that the recount so far has not substantially changed Biden's lead over Trump. Here's a quote from, what's this guy's name? Patrick Moore, a lawyer for Biden. As expected, the counties have completed their audit thus far. The counties that have completed their audit thus far have shifted vote totals but almost imperceptibly, and thus far in favor of Joe Biden. So the lead there is 14,000. And now Trump has decided that it's a waste of time, because his tweeted remark is, the Georgia recount is a scam. It means nothing. Well, okay. So it really is whiplash-inducing, because Trump seems to be getting pretty strong feedback from the people who talk to him that it's over. But he feels like he's going to let down his millions of MAGA maniacs. And so he has to preserve this unreality until it is fully unsustainable. Oh, and there's one more lawsuit over in Detroit that was thrown out. A Michigan judge late Friday handed another setback, rejecting a GOP effort to force a manual inspection of absentee ballots in Wayne County, which is where Detroit is. Chief Judge Timothy Kenney in the 3rd Judicial Circuit Court in Wayne County wrote that Republican poll observers who filed affidavits paint a picture of sinister, fraudulent activities that either lacked specifics or were decidedly contradicted by information, evidence. The Republican observers who sued were called election challengers, a type of poll watcher in Michigan who's specially appointed by political parties and interest groups. They had asked the judge to order an independent audit of absentee ballots in Wayne County and to stop the state from certifying election results in the meantime. The judge noted that Detroit election officials had invited qualified election challengers and political parties to do a walkthrough of the absentee ballot counting process before the election, but none of the Republicans accepted the offer. And they lacked a full understanding of the process. If they had actually attended, the questions and concerns they raised might have been answered. The judge, in his decision, said no formal challenges were filed. However, sinister, fraudulent motives were ascribed to the process in the city of Detroit. Plaintiffs' interpretation of events is incorrect and not credible. A judge in Philadelphia rejected 5 separate appeals that the Trump campaign had raised on more than 8,000 absentee ballots that were missing certain pieces of information on a declaration that voters had to fill out, sign, and return with the ballot. In Arizona, lawyers for Trump's campaign filed a brief notice that effectively gave up a challenge to overvotes in Maricopa County. Those are ballots where somebody voted for too many candidates in a single race. That was after the Arizona Secretary of State declared in a filing that Biden was too far ahead for that legal challenge to change the outcome. It affected only 191 ballots, potentially. Oh, and in Pennsylvania, the remaining issue in the lawsuit that was revised centers on disqualifying ballots cast by voters who were given an opportunity to fix mail-in ballots that were going to be disqualified on a technicality. And this is called curing your ballot. And I will acknowledge that the ability to cure a ballot varies from one jurisdiction to the next. It's not consistent or uniform, and it could be viewed as arbitrary. But in my view, it is simply honoring the intention of the voter who made a minor clerical or technical error. And because so many people are new to mail-in voting this year, that seems quite fair to me. And again, you can't find enough cases where that might be a factor to change the outcome of the election. And get this, the New York Times has done an analysis of the 3 major cities that Trump and his allies point fingers at: Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee. And of course, it plays to the biases and deep-seated racist feelings of many Trumpists. because these are majority black cities and they're run by Democrats. And so this is all you need, right? To suspect, if not conclude, that that's where the election was stolen from Trump. But the fixation this year is misplaced. All three cities voted pretty much the same way they did in 2016. Turnout barely budged relative to other areas in the same states. Biden saw no remarkable surge in support, certainly nothing that would bolster claims of ballot stuffing or tampered vote tallies. And get this, Trump even picked up marginally more votes this year in all three cities than he did 4 years ago. So yeah, those evil Democrats were rigging votes, and to cover up their chicanery, they gave more votes to Trump. Oh, man. This is just so bizarre. And I see a lot of people who position themselves as election integrity advocates, some of whom are using articles in the Epoch Times, that's the one run by Falun Gong, which is doing the Reverend Moon tactic of defending an embattled president in order to win favor. And here's Barry Burden, a political scientist, University of Wisconsin-Madison. From a partisan perspective, this has little to do with his loss in Wisconsin, which resulted mostly from small shifts in the white vote outside of the city, particularly suburbs. Instead, the professor said the president appears to be practicing thinly veiled race baiting by blaming communities of color for his loss. And here's Andrew Gillespie, political scientist, Emory University, just explaining the basics, that big cities are slower to count ballots. And for many on the right, their suspicions were spiking because it appeared on election night that Trump had a small lead, and then the next morning, big numbers were posted for these three cities that shifted the vote tally in favor of Biden. And that's where they imagined somebody backed up a big truck and just unloaded a bunch of ballots that had been prefabricated to support Biden. And Philadelphia actually stands out as the only county in eastern Pennsylvania where Trump actually improved on his margins this year. And this was based on hunches that many college students didn't vote on campus because they weren't there due to the pandemic. So this fantasy is evaporating. When will Trump actually accept it? And will he formally concede? Or will he just quietly lift his blockage of the levers of government, such as at the General Services Administration, where he could quietly allow the executive there, her name's Murphy, I think, to fund the transition for Biden. He can allow the national security briefings to begin. And he can basically just lift the restrictions he's placed on his political appointees. I want to recommend to you, Frank Bruni is not my favorite op-ed columnist, but in today's New York Times, he serves up a snarky beauty of a column. And he's talking to Ivanka and Jared. And he asks them, was it worth it? It's a question for the whole shockingly populous court of collaborators around Trump. Time will tell. Trump isn't ending. Trump himself isn't going away. He'll have his pack. Maybe he'll have a new media venture. There's that rumor. And, call it a threat, he's eyeing 2024. A wagon hitched to his may not be veering into the ditch just yet. But the wagon that belonged to Jared and Ivanka was different from the others. It didn't fit neatly into the Trump administration's motley caravan of expedience and ambition. They were glossier grifters. That dissonance brought them special derision because it was a particularly unsettling illustration of the trade-offs that people are willing to make, the compromises they can talk themselves into. Later he says, Pence and Pompeo and their fellow evangelicals didn't and won't begrudge them their worship of Trump, because all of them found that twisted religion together. And no serious observer is disillusioned by McConnell because no serious observer had any illusions about him in the first place. He does what he must to maximize his impact. But what of Jared and Ivanka? They epitomize the very entitled elite class of ivy-groomed, Davos-bound Americans that her father mocked. They were sanctioning the savaging of their soon-to-be former friends. You could say that they defected. But are they really going to be content in their new social homeland now that 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is no longer its clubhouse? Oh, and here's another snarky item. Mar-a-Lago makes some sense. But it's Melania's sandbox, and she and Ivanka play together about as sweetly as Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio do. New Jersey is where the Kushners have their roots, but Ivanka is accustomed to more glitz than that. At this point, they're Aspen, not Asbury Park. And one other wag on my Facebook feed suggested that we need an immediate inventory of the White House art and furniture collections. But don't bother with the books. They're going to be safe. Over at the Trump law firm known as the Justice Department, Bill Barr got a big slapback from 16 of his federal prosecutors around the country who signed on to a letter that he received on Friday. The protests are just the latest rebuke of Barr by his own employees. They object to the memo that he sent out a week ago today, telling them to look for serious voter fraud. And first, his line prosecutors said they'd found no evidence of substantial allegations of voting and vote tabulation irregularities, as Barr had suggested in his memo. They also asked him to rescind that memo, saying it thrust the department into partisan politics and was unnecessary because no one has identified any legitimate suspicions of mass voter fraud. The memo is not based in fact, the prosecutor said. Later they write, it was developed and announced without consulting nonpartisan career professionals in the field and at the department. The timing of the memo's release thrust career prosecutors into partisan politics. And this article covering that by the New York Times from the Saturday paper noted the little caveat that Barr included in his memo that got my attention and made me suggest last week that Barr wrote the memo to appease Trump, but he created a huge out for those prosecutors to essentially do nothing. Because in the memo was this caveat, specious, speculative, fanciful, or far-fetched claims should not be the basis for initiating federal inquiries. Nothing here should be taken as any indication that the department has concluded that voting irregularities have impacted the outcome of any election. As I said last week, I think Barr did that in a clever way to keep Trump happy while giving just a big loophole for his prosecutors to say, well, I don't have to do anything in that case. Two pieces of analysis about the election on subsequent days from the New York Times. Over the weekend, Michael Wines wrote a piece suggesting that the Republican efforts to suppress the vote in the belief that the fewer voters who participate, the higher the probability the Republicans will win, that is an outdated strategic idea for the Republican Party. The article says that a strategy Republicans long relied on largely fell flat can be explained by the partisan divisions that drove record turnout by self-inflicted wounds on the part of the president and by a pandemic that turned a gradual trend toward voting early, by mail or in person, into a stampede. The outcomes raise questions about whether the Republican strategy of voter restrictions served the party's interests as it once did. And this goes back to the 1980s. I'm trying to remember this guy's name. He was a leading Republican ally of Ronald Reagan. And he basically said, the more people vote, the more we lose. And so we need to limit registration, participation by women, by people of color, by people in Democratic strongholds. We'll implement photo IDs. We'll purge the voter rolls. We'll limit the number of polling places in certain communities, so long lines will discourage people from sticking around to vote. These are just some of the tactics, and they have been extremely effective. But if you'll pardon the expression, I think they were trumped by the high turnout, including from Trump supporters, in this November's election. They quote Norman Ornstein. He's over at the American Enterprise Institute, a conservative think tank. Stereotypes die hard, and this Republican idea that if more people vote, it benefits Democrats was at some level more true in the past. It was certainly true when Republicans believed that white working-class voters were Democrats. But it's a ridiculous stereotype now. They also quote Richard Hazen, election law expert at UC Irvine. As long as the Republican Party is going to depend on whiter, older, and more rural electorate, they're going to make it harder for some people to register and vote. So I'm glad that that has reached the point of diminishing returns. Now, in a piece published today under the byline of Michael Powell in the Times, they take a look at one of the ballot measures that California voters rejected. It would have reestablished affirmative action, particularly in university admissions here in California. And it was rejected by a wide margin, 57 to 43%. Now, this initiative is an exception to my pushback on long-distance analysts who claimed that the Uber initiative, that the rent control initiative, that these were rejected and that they define the state on the liberal to conservative spectrum. And I don't agree with that because these campaigns were heavily funded by the special interests that benefit from them, and they used a lot of deceptive claims to get their way. Well, on this proposition that would have reinstated affirmative action, there wasn't much campaigning. And what there was from the pro side, and it basically just showed that Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris and other prominent people in the state support it. And it was defeated by an alliance, unofficial, of Latino voters and Asian Americans. And this is at the expense of African Americans, because when it comes to admissions to the University of California and other public institutes of higher education here in California, it's blacks who have suffered the biggest setback since we eliminated affirmative action in the 1990s. But get this. In San Bernardino, Latinos make up more than half of the county's population, and more residents there voted on affirmative actions, that proposition, than voted for president, rejecting it by a margin of 28 points. And in the southernmost county of California, Imperial County, where 85% of the population is Latino, the voters there who gave Biden a 27-point margin of victory went against the affirmative action measure by 16 percentage points. So this is, I think, a legitimate analysis that suggests that the Democrats can no longer just wedge in particularly Latino voters, and assume that they are with the Democratic Party and its agenda in all cases. And that presents a real challenge long term for Democrats who currently comprise the supermajority in both houses and control the governorship. And I can't think of a single statewide constitutional officer who is Republican right now. So in the remaining days of the Peter B. Collins News and Comment podcast, I'm going to give special focus to what's going on in the lame duck session. And let me begin by what's not happening. There is no progress on a new COVID relief package. We're not seeing any ongoing discussions. The parties have kind of staked out their positions. And it appears that McConnell is willing to let people be evicted, let them see their health care coverage lapse, with no unemployment benefits, no $1,200 checks, no relief for state and local governments that will, in turn, be laying off people and cutting services in the first quarter. But here's what they are doing. The Republicans are trying to get a lame duck session confirmation of a woman named Judy Shelton to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Bank. And she is quite an extremist. She's a gold bug, meaning she wants to return to the gold standard, and I consider that to be ridiculous and unachievable. And secondly, she wants to essentially make the Federal Reserve more responsive to political leaders and political demands. While I believe there's a great deal of room for investigation and reform of the Federal Reserve Bank and the way it operates with very little transparency, I don't think that Judy Shelton is actually going to provide that. So it gets complicated. Lamar Alexander, the lame duck senator from Tennessee, has announced he will not support her nomination, joining Susan Collins of Maine, freshly reelected, and Mitt Romney of Utah. And to complicate things further, Senator Rick Scott of Florida is quarantining in Florida and is not expected to be in Washington, at least not this week. So this brings it to a tie where Vice President Pence could cast the vote that puts her over. And of course, that presumes unity among Democrats. And if the vote drags into early December, Mark Kelly, the freshly elected senator from Arizona, will be seated because he was elected to complete John McCain's term. And so he gets seated or, inducted into the Senate before the new session starts in January. In her past writings and remarks, Shelton has said the Fed harnesses too much power, should be reined in, wants to return to the gold standard. And she was described as an advisor to the Trump campaign in 2016. Here's another issue for the lame duck session. A judge has followed through on a declaration that was made, I believe, by the General Accounting Office, the GAO, a month or two ago. And that is that Chad Wolf, who is the acting director of Homeland Security and has presided over the suspension of DACA, the deployment of Trump's palace guard to Portland and other cities, that the actions he has taken are not lawful because he assumed his position unlawfully. And I also believe that even had he been promoted lawfully, that he has gone past the deadline for a person to be an acting cabinet official without being confirmed by the Senate. So a federal judge has ruled that Chad Wolf assumed his position unlawfully, The judge has invalidated Wolf's suspension of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And Judge Nicholas Garalfas said, DHS failed to follow the order of succession as it was lawfully designated. Therefore, the actions taken by purported acting secretaries who were not properly in their roles according to the lawful order of succession were taken without legal authority. Now, I believe this also applies to the guy who was elevated last week after Mark Esper was fired as the Secretary of Defense. I don't have his name in front of me. I think it's Christopher Miller. And he was not the designated on-deck hitter when Mark Esper was terminated by his president. So it remains to be seen how this will be sorted out. We are in lame duck territory. Trump may not wish to fight it, but he likes to fight. He especially likes to deploy lawyers that he doesn't have to pay. So we'll see how that sorts out, and we'll also find out if any of these other yokels who've been acting secretaries so that Trump had more leverage on them will see their actions invalidated. It's a fascinating set of legal issues. And here's one more lame duck concern. The Trump administration has suddenly called for oil and gas companies to pick spots where they'd like to drill and destroy the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. So this proceeds from legislation that was adopted in 2017 authorizing drilling in the refuge. And if you follow the procedures where this announcement was made, and there has to be a 30-day public comment period, and extractors need to file applications for a lease, well, theoretically and presumably, by mid-January, some of these leases may be finalized. Of course, it requires an appetite by the oil extractors to operate in an area that doesn't have much infrastructure, and the oil companies have become a little bit sensitive to public opinion based on climate change concerns about extraction in the Arctic Sea. I want to recommend an investigative report under the byline of Aline Brown, published at The Intercept yesterday. And Brown got a hold of documents, government documents, that show that the private security companies, the mercenary groups who were hired by the pipeline company that wants to install that pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, through Standing Rock. Well, Tiger Swan was the security firm that was hired by Energy Transfer, the pipeline company, and they have lied repeatedly, saying that they were only consultants, that they didn't create any plans or activate any plans. But this investigative report shows that one of their employees, Tiger Swan, was an ex-Marine named Joel McCullough. And McCullough, based on these newly released documents, was assigned to infiltrate one of the protest groups at Standing Rock. And Tiger Swan has already been found in violation of state law, fined $2 million, or could have been fined $2 million. Looks like they settled it for 10% of that. But they were not registered as a security firm in North Dakota. And then they lied, claiming that they didn't actually do what they actually did, and the documents show that they did what they did. And so it was quite insidious. And let's recall that this occurred during the Obama administration. And while Barack was on 60 Minutes last night pimping his book and shaming Trump, and that's legit, he was there sugarcoating his first term as president. This is from the second term, which is the subject of his extensive 700-page memoir that, frankly, I don't plan to read, because I'm going to retire and read some novels instead of nonfiction political junk. So I commend The Intercept, an outlet that I often find a basis to criticize, for some excellent investigative reporting there. As I've mentioned, a week from Wednesday will be the final News and Comment podcast, and I've just started scheduling my last interviews with guests who have been frequently on this program and that I've really enjoyed talking with. Thomas Frank, Pepe Escobar, Dr. Justin Frank, the author of Trump on the Couch. They're in the first wave, and I plan to have those interviews posted for you within the next week or so. And I have about a dozen people on that list. I'm not sure I'll be able to connect with all of them. But when I finish posting that series of interview podcasts, I plan to have a couple of episodes with listeners. And I'm even thinking about having a friend interview me as a final in-depth interview podcast. So we'll see how all that plays out. But I want to remind you that if you currently have a subscription, I have your email. And if you currently have a subscription, you must go to PayPal and cancel your PayPal order. I'm unable to do that from my side of the digital paywall. And so I don't want to be emptying your wallet for $5, $10, $20, or even a $50 annual renewal as I am winding down. So please do take care of that. Every day I get notices from PayPal that people are canceling. And there's so many of you that PayPal sent me an alert as if I've been selling poison and everybody is stopping payment on it. I found that a little bit amusing. Now, if you're not currently a subscriber and you don't think I have your email, just send me a note. Peter, put me on your email list. And if and when I break silence after the first of the year and do an occasional podcast, I will send out an alert. Also, it'll go through the typical process of being on my website, triggering RSS feeds at iTunes and TuneIn and Spreaker and Stitcher and that site in Germany that never asked me for permission to post my podcast. So if you get it that way, there's a good chance you'll get an alert that way. But don't leave it to chance. Drop me an email, and when you do, I'm asking people to just list off 5, maybe 10 websites, podcasts that you enjoy for people who are saying, Peter, what am I going to do when your podcast doesn't show up anymore? Well, on Friday night, Aaron Mate, who is now a regular reporter at the Gray Zone Project, he went on the Tucker Carlson Fox News Fest. And I find it interesting because there are a lot of people who think that anybody who appears on Fox is automatically discredited. And I know that what Aaron Mate was talking about would cause CNN and MSNBC to say, well, he's never coming on any of our shows. So you dance with the people who invite you. And Mate, I thought, did a great job of pointing out how top Pentagon officials and the Middle East envoy James Jeffrey have bragged about how he and other officials misled Trump in order to preserve the U.S. military occupation, minor as it is, in northeastern Syria. And while I have many, 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 many deep-seated objections to Donald Trump, I support his efforts to bring our troops home. Should have happened a long, long time ago. And so the idea that people who are sworn to uphold the Constitution would lie to the chief executive, as odious as he is, I think is really, really offensive. And in the course of that conversation, Mate also got Tucker Carlson to buy in. I think Carlson has covered some of this himself, that the weapons attack in Douma, Syria in 2018, which was alleged to have been a chemical attack, was not in fact involving chemicals, and that the Organization for the Proliferation of Chemical Weapons, is that what it's called? I can never remember what the P stands for. At any rate, the OPCW deployed its inspectors who came back and wrote a report, and then it was countermanded by their bosses who rewrote the report to conform with the political propaganda. So I congratulate Aaron Mate for getting those messages out there. The same thing is true in Afghanistan, where Trump has repeatedly called to bring the troops home, and at every turn he has been thwarted by his underlings. And so if that is the sole explanation for the purge at the Pentagon and the installation of cronies and loyalists, because they were being lied to and blocked by the people who have recently been forced out, well, I'll be okay with that. Again, I'm a little bit wary that Trump could try something domestically with U.S. troops, or he could launch a lame duck attack on Iran or Venezuela. And if that's the case, I don't think you have any doubt, I am 100% opposed. Pepe Escobar is one of the people I have lined up for a last interview. We're scheduled to talk on Thursday, and if that happens, you'll hear it shortly thereafter. His latest dispatch reveals something I have seen no coverage in the U.S. media about, and that is there is now an agreement between China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP. It's been in the making for 8 years. It connects 30% of the global economy and 2.2 billion people with, limited tariffs and lowered restrictions on trade. It seals this is Pepe talking, it seals East Asia as the undisputed prime hub of geoeconomics. The Asian century, in fact, was already in the making way back in the 1990s, and among those Asians, as well as Western expats who identified it, Pepe published his book called 21st, the Asian Century, way back in 1997. And he argues that RCEP may force the West to do some homework to understand that the main story here is not that it excludes the U.S. or that it's designed by China. It's an East Asia-wide agreement initiated by the ASEAN Alliance and debated among equals since 2012. He writes, by now it's clear at last in vast swaths of East Asia that RCEP's 20 chapters will reduce tariffs across the board, simplify customs with at least 65% of service sectors fully open, with increased foreign shareholding limits. It'll solidify supply chains by privileging common rules of origin and codify new e-commerce regulations. And he links this to China's Belt and Road Initiative, what he calls the New Silk Roads. And he notes the West has not ceased to distort the Belt and Road Initiative without actually acknowledging how the initiative they have been slandering is actually so popular in the vast majority of countries along the Belt and Road Initiative route. Later, he notes that RCEP marks the irredeemable failure of Obama's TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was the NATO on trade arm of the pivot to Asia, dreamed up at the Obama State Department. It also inevitably marks the irredeemable failure of the decoupling fallacy, as well as all attempts to drive a wedge between China and its East Asian trade partners. And he later writes, but then there's the Russia-China strategic partnership, which should be enhanced economically. Moscow's concept of Greater Eurasia involves deeper involvement both east and west, including the expansion of the Eurasia Economic Union, which, for instance, has free trade deals with nations like Vietnam. So it's a fascinating development that leaves the United States to some extent in the dust, and it remains to be seen if this will become some sort of irritant to the United States. Well, we've been reporting occasionally on the struggle over Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan launched a hot war at the end of September. They have declared victory. They've agreed in a deal brokered by Russia to take over parts of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the settlement is now in the process of being implemented. But in the village of Kalbajar, almost all of the residents have moved out, dismantled their homes, and set them on fire. Some of this is religious tension. The Azeris who will be moving in are Muslim. The Armenians are Christian. And one of the residents said, "In the end, we will blow it up or set it on fire in order not to leave anything to Muslims." And in face of that, Azerbaijan has postponed their takeover of these disputed areas of Nagorno-Karabakh. They're going to wait now until November 25th after a request from the Armenians. I haven't commented too much on the events at the Vatican. Last week, a report was issued that shows that Saint Pope John Paul II knew about Cardinal McCarrick, who was later defrocked by the current Pope Francis. And it calls into question the canonization of John Paul II. And as a recovering Catholic, I embrace the message of Jesus Christ as a philosopher, not as a son of God, as I was taught. And it really pains me to see the mortals who run a criminal operation, a racketeering scheme, based on a fraternity and a huge real estate empire, with the sideline of sexual abuse. And so I agree with the Vatican watchers who are critical of the race to canonize John Paul II. And I ding Francis for canonizing Junipero Serra, a man with a very checkered history who exploited the native population here in California as he built the mission system. And hundreds of thousands of First Nation peoples were killed, and many others were forced to convert to Catholicism. And this whole thing about canonization is so creepy, and I hope I'm not offending any of my Catholic listeners, but it's where the church veers into superstition. Because in order to be canonized, you have to have miracles attributed to you. This then leads to traffic in relics linked to the people who've been canonized. And I just find that ridiculous. So the watchdog agency for the police department in New York City suddenly unloaded 4 top senior officials on Thursday. This has been described as a restructuring meant to deploy more of their resources to investigations, but it appears to be a blue wall cover-up and retaliation against people who have dug into the myriad complaints of police misconduct in New York City. Well, we'll see where that one goes. Here's today's COVID-19 update, edited by Linda Lewis. The drug maker, first of all, we like to give you the statistics. The caseload in the United States has jumped up by almost 1 million just in the last week or 10 days. We are approaching 11 million cases. There were 138,000 new cases reported yesterday. That's down from the recent peaks, but it's likely to go up later this week. We have a total death count attributed to COVID at 245,000, and 660 new deaths were reported yesterday, and that's often the case over the weekend where the numbers are lower than the average. So the big news today is that Moderna, the drug and vaccine developer, has announced that its vaccine, in the early test trials, has an effective rate of 94.5%. Now, I'm really conflicted here because I, realize that until we have a vaccine or until we reach herd immunity through a massive kill-off of our population, that we will not put the coronavirus behind us. And at the same time, this rush to develop and distribute a vaccine makes me extremely nervous because I fear that corners are being cut, pressure is being placed to make these studies turn out as positively as possible. And if you remember, just a week ago it was Pfizer who said, big breakthrough. We studied 94 people. And we think that our vaccine that requires refrigeration to minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit is going to be ready soon. Well, Moderna did this earlier this year. They reported progress toward a vaccine. Their stock shot up. Executives sold. Last week, the chairman of Pfizer cashed out $5 or $6 million of his shares. And so the profit-taking that occurs with these announcements starkly undermines their credibility. And then, and let me just say that I've never studied vaccine studies, and so I could be wrong about what I'm about to tell you. But listen to this. In Moderna's study, 95 people contracted the virus. 5 of them got the vaccine, and 90 got the placebo. And based on those 5, against the 90 in the control group, they're claiming it's 94.5% effective. Now, I'm sorry. That is a stunningly small sample. And we're supposed to just nod our heads and say, oh, great, vaccine's coming. The 95 cases included 15 people over 65, 20 people Hispanic, Black, Asian, or multiracial. They say the vaccine appeared equally safe and effective in all the subgroups. 5 people got it. How do you determine potential side effects when 5 people were given the vaccine? And if I'm wrong about this and you have a science background, please correct me. I will not be offended. Email Peter at peterbcollins.com. So based on this, Moderna said it'll have 20 million doses ready by the end of December. Pfizer said it'll have 50 million by then. Both of the vaccines require 2 shots a couple of weeks apart. And Linda notes that Pfizer and Moderna both announced their findings in news releases, not in peer-reviewed scientific journals. The companies haven't disclosed the detailed data that would allow outside experts to evaluate their claims. And I know Trump is pissed because he wanted these 2 announcements to be made before the election. And when you couple that with the profiteering that is baked into our pharmaceutical industry and the regulation of it, we must remain quite skeptical. In other news, from the journal Science, a report that 10% of nearly 1,000 COVID patients who developed life-threatening pneumonia had antibodies that disable key immune system proteins called interferons. And these antibodies, known as autoantibodies, because they attack the body itself, were not found in 663 people with mild or asymptomatic COVID infections. Only 4 of 1,200 healthy individuals had the autoantibodies, and this study was published on October 23rd. Here's a quote from Dr. Eric Topol at Scripps Research in San Diego. This is one of the most important things we've learned about the immune system since the start of the pandemic. It is a breakthrough finding. The same authors found that an additional 3.5% of critically ill patients had mutations in genes that control the interferons. They serve as the body's first line of defense against infection, sounding the alarm and activating an army of virus-fighting genes. Interferons are like a fire alarm and a sprinkler system all in one. They're particularly important for protecting the body against new viruses like the coronavirus, which the body has never encountered. And Linda hastened to add, before I give you the name of the next person quoted here, his name is Paul Bastard, or perhaps it's Bastard. But she said that's not a typo. Significantly, patients didn't make autoantibodies in response to the virus. They appeared to have had them before the pandemic even began. And for reasons that researchers don't understand, the autoantibodies never caused a problem until patients were infected with COVID-19. In yet another unexpected finding, 94% of patients in the study with these autoantibodies were male. About 12.5% of men with life-threatening COVID pneumonia had the autoantibodies against interferon, compared with only 2.6% of women. So that's pretty stunning. And here's another finding that is fascinating. According to the World Health Organization, an outbreak of the disease we now know as COVID-19 was first reported in Wuhan in December. Italy's first COVID patient was detected February 21st in a town near Milano. But a study by researchers at the National Cancer Institute in Milan found that COVID-19 antibodies in blood samples from as early as September last year. This came from a totally separate group of people. They examined the blood samples of about 1,000 people who were volunteers of a cancer trial, beginning in September and running through March of this year. More than 11% had developed coronavirus antibodies specific to the new COVID SARS-CoV-2 well before February, including 14% from blood samples taken in September last year. Around 30% of the antibodies detected were from the second week of February, when the virus started to grip Lombardy. This study shows an unexpected, very early circulation of COVID among asymptomatic individuals in Italy several months before the first patient was identified. That is a showstopper. And finally today, it was a tweet storm after the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, that woman, announced a 3-week pause to save lives, closing colleges, high schools, workplaces, and in-person dining as coronavirus cases have spiked. She appealed to the Trump administration to intervene, and she got a response from Scott Atlas, the medical doctor with no experience in viruses or pandemics. And she wrote, he urged residents to reject the state's public health guidelines. Quote, "The only way this stops is if people rise up. You get what you accept. Hashtag freedom matters. Hashtag step up." Critics immediately condemned his rise up rhetoric, which mirrored Trump's previous calls to liberate Michigan and led to the effort to kidnap and assassinate Governor Whitmer. So she responded to the tweet by going on CNN. She defended her order for a 3-week pause. "We know that the White House likes to single us out here in Michigan, me in particular," Whitmer said. "I'm not going to be bullied into not following reputable scientists and medical professionals." The Attorney General of Michigan, Dana Nessel, also slammed Atlas, calling the tweet disappointing, irresponsible, and the reason why the United States finds itself in such desperate circumstances. "A patriot is one who protects America from its enemies, both foreign and domestic," she said. "COVID-19 is the enemy, not each other. Stop pitting Americans against each other." And in what Linda describes accurately as a classic example of gaslighting, Dr. Atlas followed up in a tweet, "Hey, I never was talking at all about violence. People vote, people peacefully protest. Never would I endorse or incite violence. Never." Yeah, right. And in addition to Michigan, the governors of Oregon and New Mexico, and the state of Washington, have all imposed new and aggressive restrictions. Here's Michelle Lujan Grisham, governor of New Mexico. We're in a life-or-death situation. If we don't act right now, we cannot preserve the lives. We can't keep saving lives, and we will absolutely crush our current health system and infrastructure. And Kate Brown, Oregon's governor, said, for the last 8 months, I've been asking Oregonians to follow the letter and spirit of the law. We have chosen not to engage law enforcement. At this point in time, unfortunately, we have no other option. And in following up to my own issues about the safety of a coronavirus vaccine, the FDA is expected to review these two candidates in the next few weeks. And I am pleased to see that about a half dozen states, including California, New York, and the District of Columbia, have all said that they're going to set up their own teams of experts to evaluate it before they agree to distribute it in their states. But I want to single out Dr. Julie Morita, who's quoted in this New York Times report. She's a VP at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is a philanthropy that does a lot of good work. But the guy who set it up and presumably still has a role there is Robert Woody Johnson, who is Trump's ambassador to England. And I don't suggest that that makes Julie Morita some sort of a puppet to Woody Johnson. But we have to be skeptical when she says, well, the last thing we need right now is any kind of miscommunication about what the recommendations are. The more aligned everybody is, the better for the public. And she has been appointed to President-elect Biden's COVID-19 task force. I will be watching her and watching her carefully. And finally today, I want to thank John Zwiebel, who sent me an article that I hadn't seen from The Guardian about the exodus from the San Francisco Bay Area. And it is a fact that people are leaving San Francisco. The number of folks who have broken leases on apartments and houses is a very high number. This has led to a precipitous drop in the rate of rents. $5,000 a month units are now going for $3,200. And the Guardian article points out that the moving industry is gouging people. If you want to rent a U-Haul truck to move from Phoenix to San Francisco, it'll only set you back $311 plus gas. But if you want to go from San Francisco to Phoenix, the rental rate alone is $2,500. And that's based on demand that U-Haul has to bring those trucks back, often empty. So also there are people jumping into the moving business who aren't licensed and insured. Some of them have just taken a load of furniture and have never been seen again. There's been a 74% surge in consumer complaints about movers since last year. So it is happening. That is a fact. And as I wrap up today, I got an email from Tao Lin. He's a listener to this podcast who lives in Florida, and he is a virtuoso-level concert pianist. And he was one of the people who we shelled out $100 for in the community fund that you helped support earlier this year. Well, I'm very pleased to report that he is back on the 88s. He performed in an online concert last night, sponsored by a group from Vancouver called Muse West. And I have a link to the YouTube video of his performance that I'm inserting in the podcast show file for today. And I encourage you to click on it. It's a little cooler than listening to this. Thank you for listening to my daily news and comment podcast while it lasts. You'll find it on YouTube. And I remain Peter B. Collins.
Trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.